as a mystic in skeptic's clothing, right? I'm going to approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to look at everything. I'm going to use science. I think science is very valuable. But I'm also operating with the understanding that I'm operating with a limited understanding. Science can't see everything yet. We don't know everything yet. There is more. So there's a case to be made for some stuff. And so as a mystic, I'm going within for answers. I'm not going without. I'm not running to YouTube. I'm not going to the Bright Insight YouTube channel for my answers.
You're not?
No, I'll go to academia first, but ultimately I'll go within. And if it's not right within, it's not going to be right without.
How do you know if it's right within, though?
You know, there's a knowing. It's gnosis. And ultimately, it's not about what's right or wrong. Who gets to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad? Religions, they tell us, oh, Jesus is good, the devil's bad. Well, Jesus, if he is the way, if he's the salvation back to the creator, he's the principle of return to source. There's a source. We come from the source. We're here. We return. It's the same principle in ancient Egypt as Horus. Horus represents the return to source. Horus's opposition in that story is Set, Setian forces, which become Satan, which become the devil. Set is the principle of opposition. So our goal in humanity is to have this experience. According to the ancient mystery schools, the Pythagorean mystery schools, they viewed it as, it's like we're mirrors of the divine. We are extensions of the divine experiencing itself through us in this universe, and we are going to return back to source. But some people believe that in order to do that, you have to prepare. There's a process. The ancient Egyptians had this whole, afterlife carved out for them. They had to go through processes. And like I said, like the fourth way, the Gurdjieff teachings, you got to start preparing now to leave an impression on your consciousness with your ka and with your ba, which are terms we don't use anymore. We just have a soul. For the ancient Egyptians, they had 9 different aspects, and the ka and the ba would reunite in the afterlife and come together to form what's known as a ak. And ak is the light. It's the fully realized, illuminated individual.
I understand what you mean when you talk about religions telling us good and bad or this or that and defining things for us. In some cases, it's strictly just based on a belief system or something like that, meaning it's not inherent. Let me explain that. To me, I don't want to say this. When you start to say there's how do we determine what's good and bad, we don't. Like there's things that can't define that for us. To me, when you get it down to brass tacks and just look at the world, remove religion, remove governments, remove spiritual teachings, whatever. There's a lot of gray area for sure, but there's certain things that I think are common sense with what we gotta, what we gotta face in the world. For an example, if you go out, if you leave here right now and you go find a woman on the street and against her consent, have your way with her, that's wrong. I'm willing to sit here and say on the record on this podcast, inherently, if you're looking at good and bad, that's bad. If you went and some dude on the street, you shot him to death for no reason. Perfectly good guy, you didn't know him, you just shot him to death. That's wrong. So don't you think it gets a little weird when we start saying, well, to go within, we can't really know what's right and wrong. Doesn't that take it like a step too far?
One, each situation is going to be nuanced. Right? There's who gets to determine what, that's why we have courts of law and all of this, and it doesn't always end up serving justice. But what I'm saying is in terms of right and wrong, yes, there's a moral compass. You figure out what your moral compass is to determine for yourself. But what I'm talking about is, if you attack that woman on the street improperly or you kill someone, both of those instances are destructive. So to me, it's all energy. You're either going to have positive or negative energy. And negative, that's all negative because it's destructive. It's going to destroy. But destruction is not always evil. Destruction is not always bad. People look at fire. Oh my God, the fire it's a horrible thing. In esoteric traditions, fire is the initiating principle. Because you're going to burn everything down to start anew. The Mesoamerican, the Maya, they would do a slash and burn technique in the fields. They would burn everything down and renew. It was about, fire is the initiating principle. If you get in a tarot, the first tarot card, it has the fire elements and all of that. Fire is in the beginning because it's going to initiate the way for something new. So my point is that everything is energy. It's either positive or negative, or it could be neutral, right? And so when we start determining, well, this is the good guy and this is the bad guy, I feel it's like, I won't say Jesus and Satan, because there's probably a lot of sensitive Christians that might be listening. Let's say Horus and Set from the ancient Egyptian tradition. Set is the hero, Horus is the hero, and Set is the bad guy. Why Set the bad guy? Because he killed, he destroyed Horus's father, Osiris. He dismembered him, cut him up into pieces, and then the mother, Osiris, goes and resurrects him. It's all part of the Egyptian mythology. Set isn't necessarily the bad guy. He's not even a guy. He is a principle. He is a principle, is representing opposition. When you get up in the morning and you get your podcast going and then suddenly, you're not getting the right levels or your computer's not opening up, that is Set in action. Anything that is opposition is Set. So anything, your goal in life, according to esoteric traditions, are to return back to the source. Anything that gets in the way of that, providing opposition, is Set in action. But we need Set. People are afraid of the devil. I say sit down, have breakfast, and meditate with the devil.
Why?
You need to go through the fire to rise up as the phoenix from the ash.
Oh, so it's this, and correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I always talk about, like, if the world were a perfect place and there were nothing evil, there wouldn't be a point to it because there would be no feeling of up and down, like accomplishment or whatever. Are you saying something similar here?
In a sense, it's like, how can you truly appreciate love if you haven't gone through or light and dark? How can you appreciate the light if you've always had light? If your whole life has been good and you've been handed everything and everything's good for you, how are you ever going to appreciate that? Versus someone who hasn't had everything, someone who's had to go through struggles and overcome obstacles and work their way through and sustain to get where they're at, they're going to have a different appreciation when that reward comes. And when Julian, Dorey calls them up and invites them to their podcast, they're going to appreciate it because they've gone through the struggle. You know what I mean? To get there. So the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that we need opposition. Esoteric tradition, recognizes the importance of two complementary aspects, and it's often encoded in architecture. What I mean by that is, in simple terms, you need a male, positive, female, negative, receptive. Male and female must come together to form new life. You need a positive current and a negative current to come together to form electricity. It is through opposition of complementary opposites that the creative principle is manifested. Nothing will be created without some sort of opposition. You need to, in a sense, all of this is your adversary. You need to overcome, you got to make sure the levels are right in order to produce this podcast.
Yes.
Two complementary opposites, male and female, need to come together to form new life. Electricity, opposites need to come together to form new life. Psychologically, if you have an adversary, and conflict is okay. It's good. It doesn't have to end in violence. We're all adults. We can have differing opinions as long as we're respectful of one another.
Right.
We don't need to do the name calling and the trying to tear somebody down with false information. We can have a discussion and arrive at new conclusions. But in order to do this, you have to go through your opposition.
That's right.
John Anthony West, we were talking about mentor, which we haven't got to.
You brought the weave back. I didn't have to do it.
I brought the weave for you. John Anthony, one of the most powerful.
You brought him up with, I just want to make sure, you brought him up with like some European guys who were talking about his aquatic whatever on the Sphinx. But
Schwaller.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. In short, John Anthony West, one of the most powerful lessons I learned from John, something that he would teach, is to give your opposition its due. We're sitting here, right? And I can step outside of myself psychologically and create this observing spectator. I can take myself out of myself and analyze a situation. Oh, am I too loud? Am I too excited? You probably do a lot of this on your own. When you're doing a podcast, you have to check your tonality, your pacing. You have to think of questions. Sometimes you have to step out of the environment. This is good when you're in an argument with someone. Because if you feel yourself fight or flight response going off, or you're getting angry, you have the power to move. I think in terms of a DJ, I used to DJ, so I'd move the crossfader on a mixing board to get more of what I need. And if you can take self-inventory of yourself in the moment, you can see what you need. So by doing that, you gain mastery over the situation. It's the top of the pyramid. Right? You're the bottom of the pyramid. I'm the other side of the bottom of the pyramid triangle. But over here is this objective truth. There's your truth. There's my truth. Then there's the objective truth. That's what I'm trying to get closest to. And the more that I can pull myself out of myself, because I have my own preconceived notions, my own limited understanding, as do you, our own conditioning from our own backgrounds, our own thought process. But if we can pull out of that, and put ourselves in a position of our opposition and get a little bit of empathy and try to understand. That's how you work things out. And people are afraid. They're afraid of challenges. People are lazy these days. They don't want to put the work in. They don't want to go through something that bothers them. Oh, this is going to be too much work.
Right.
The esoteric tradition is about doing the work, putting yourself in those uncomfortable situations, making yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable, so that when the uncomfortable, inconvenient, objective truth smacks you in the face, you're prepared. And that's what initiation's about.
Yeah, and being what you're talking about too, and I think this is so relatable to everything today, being able to put yourself in a position where you can change your opinion when faced with better evidence. That's a lesson. I don't give a fuck what it is, whether it was esotericism that did it or, some fucking guy on a YouTube channel that said you should go do this. But like, we need more of that in our society. Like, I appreciate the guys, and this is what I was saying earlier about Billy Carson. If Billy Carson had come out after the West debate and said, you know what, yeah, he made a few good points. I hadn't thought of it that way. I would have respected him so much, because I would have said, all right, there's so much information here. Maybe there are some things you're wrong about. Every fucking person out there is wrong. But when you come out and you go, no, how dare him? He's trying to stop our movement. And you sue him and all this stupid shit, you make yourself look like an asshole because you are so rigidly backed in your corner of this is my worldview and this is what it is. And in his case, I think it's for financial reasons more than anything.
He's got to protect his investment and his brand.
And it's just so disappointing, because this is how we get somewhere based on the types of conversations you seem to want to have, which is like, all right, let's put it all together and, figure out what's what.
That's what I do with my tours in Egypt. We put all the pieces on the table. We're going to give you the academic, the traditional narrative, and I know it very well, because I studied ancient Egyptian history, the mythology, the language, I know it really well. But in addition to that, I also know the alternative theories really well. And then I have my esoteric perspective. So I try to put all the pieces on the table. When I do my tours, a lot of my competitors do tours with one narrative. Lost technology. We're going to go look for this is what it must be. I throw all the pieces out there, in a sense, unbiasedly, and let the audience, the crowd, the group, decide for themselves.
Love that.
And I've toured with both sides. I've toured with the alternative side, engineer Christopher Dunn, the Kemet School, John Anthony West, who taught me, and then others that are more on the academic side. Dr. David Miano, a historian.
David Miano. I
David
think people
Miano.
were asking, is he alive?
Yeah, he's live. I just led him through Egypt for an Egypt tour.
Someone was asking.
He's famous for debunking online. He does a lot of debunk. He's a historian. He's a general historian and a teacher. He's a great guy.
I got to check him out. But go ahead. Yeah.
And so, and then I've done tours, collaborated tours with other like YouTubers that kind of walk this middle line, like that rely on evidence. Ancient architects, history for granite, history with Kaylee, and so. The whole point is I like to look at the big picture, put all the pieces on the table. Where I see a lot of the alternatives will often cherry pick certain aspects to fit their narrative. I try to put everything out there and try to give as much information as possible and let the people decide. And then if they ask for my opinion, I'll let them know. And a lot of them are often disappointed because people come on my tours expecting John Anthony West narrative, my mentor. We didn't get into it, but John Anthony West is known for his redating the Sphinx.
Yes, and you were talking about it based on aquatic
water erosion. Right. Which I don't agree with his final conclusion. While I respect my mentor and I've learned a tremendous amount from him, I do not share all of his conclusions. I do not think the Sphinx is much, much older than the Egyptologists tell us. I don't think it can be older than 3,500 BCE.
Let's start with this. Let's break down his theory, and then let's break down yours. Go.
Okay, so his theory is that the Sphinx is much older than traditional Egyptologists tell us. Why? When he was reading Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was an esotericist who had moved to Egypt, studied the Luxor Temple. Schwaller was a prodigy. At age 16, he was lecturing before the Theosophical Society doing a treatise on Pythagorean number mysticism, how numbers correspond to cosmology. And he was an esotericist. He had an esoteric background. So he approached Egyptology with this unique esoteric perspective where all the traditional Egyptologists, most of them, they're either Christian or they're strictly into the science. They're not going to pay any attention to the esoteric stuff. It's all woo-woo to them, which is unfortunate. There is a lot of woo-woo. There is a lot of charlatanism. But there's also people that are very serious. And I believe that Schwaller was a serious scholar and had a different understanding that he brought to Egypt. And he interpreted things in a different way. But in that process, at the end of his book, he writes this observation about aquatic water erosion. And what I was saying before that you won't hear anywhere else, it goes before him. He was influenced, in a sense, I wouldn't say his mentor, but he was influenced by St. Yves, who we talked about earlier. St. Yves believed the Sphinx goes back to maybe 12,000 years before the actual date, and it was the product of refugees from Atlantis. However, there was no science to back that up. He was speaking strictly philosophically, in a sense. Schwaller started making a case for that. And so Schwaller acknowledges that there's water erosion, but doesn't pay much attention to it. For West, a light bulb went off. Well, if it's water erosion, that's geology. Geology is science. So even though we have all these historical documents and texts that Schwaller's trying to make a case for a much older Egypt, this is science. And if we can put science to it, it can be proven. John was writing his books, and then eventually he was introduced to Dr. Robert Schoch, who is a geologist. John didn't have the credentials. John didn't have the ability to go and present this in the academic space. You know, he'd be ridiculed, and he was ridiculed. But then when he got with Schoch, Schoch has the certified credentials. You know, he's a geologist, paleontologist, at Yale. He teaches at Boston University. And when he went with John Anthony West to the Sphinx in the early 90s, and a lot of people credit him today because West has passed, Schoch is still alive. Schoch does a lot of conferences, and people often attribute the whole water erosion theory and hypothesis to Schoch, but it originates with West and even before West.
Yeah, but they both played a role.
Obviously. They both played a role. Yeah. And so he brings in Schoch, and when they go there, they look at the water erosion, and then Schoch ends up coming back with Thomas Dobeke in the early 90s. Thomas Dobeke brings in, he was a geophysicist, brings in state-of-the-art equipment. They do a seismic refraction survey, like tomography, where they study the ground. Basically, it's based on the exponential kinetics of the stone. In other words, if you cut stone, it's exposed to the light, and then it starts to deteriorate over time. And that deterioration is exponential, but it slows down. It's kinetic. So they use this whole process. From that, they're able to establish different, interpretations, which they did for dating the Sphinx. So there's two key observations. So John's original observation is that, if there's water erosion on the Sphinx, he went and he checked it out, and he's like, sure enough, this Sphinx looks heavily eroded. This limestone sculpture, some 70 feet tall, 270 feet wide, arguably the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, looks heavily eroded. And to understand what's going on here, it'd be important to give a brief lesson on the geology of the Sphinx, Sphinx Geology 101. The Sphinx is composed of 3 separate levels of rock strata. Starting with the head and above is the hardest, and then the majority of the body, which has alternating soft and hard levels of limestone, and then another layer below, which kind of dips through the plateau. And it kind of dips from 2 angles, and it comes from like southwest to the northeast, and it kind of rolls. So it makes it very complex. The simplest way of explaining it, you can think of the Sphinx and the geology of the Sphinx as a layer cake. This becomes important later, of stone. This becomes very important later. So when John looked at it, you could see the body, which is what they refer to as member 2, or the second layer of limestone in the Mokattam Rock Formation at Giza.
The Mokattam Rock Formation.
The Mokattam Rock, that's what it is. People call it a plateau. Okay. It's not really a plateau. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. So John observed this erosion. In fact, this story gets retold different ways. I've heard people say others have done. It was John who brought this to a curator at a museum, and he showed them an image of eroded stone, and he put duct tape across the bottom and the top of the image. So you just see the main body of stone. It's heavily eroded. And they're like, oh, it looks like erosion, heavy erosion, water erosion. John rips the duct tape off and reveals the face of the Sphinx. And they're like, oh, this is the Sphinx. John knew that he was onto something, but he didn't have the credentials. So he needed to have Schoch, a geologist, come in and verify it, which he did. John originally thought, and this is what I love about John Anthony West, because if was the last of a dying breed who has transitioned already, because if he was wrong and it could be demonstrated that he was wrong, he would stand correct. And he did, because he originally wrote, he thought it was Nile flooding because Egypt doesn't see that much rain. The Sphinx is supposed to have been carved from the living bedrock during the period of Khafra, which is the second pyramid in the chain at Giza. You have Khufu, his son Khafra, and then Menkaure. And during the time of Khafra, is when the Egyptologists say that they believe the face of the Sphinx is likely Khafra. And so this is around 2500 BCE. Okay. And so the problem is that if there's this water erosion, it doesn't really rain like that in Egypt. It hasn't been that wet throughout Egypt. And before that, you have like the Nabatean pluvials, you have the African humid period where there was rain in Egypt. Egypt used to be a savanna. In fact, dozens of times Egypt has gone from desert to savanna. You know, it's transitioned over the years. And when we look at the geology, one thing that's important to keep in mind, some of the erosion we're looking at is millions of years old. In the stone, it's been desert, tree, vegetation, desert, vegetation throughout.
Do we know what
cycles of time.
causes that?
I'm not a geologist. I'm uncertain, actually. You know, I'd have to dig into more of the geology.
A great answer.
Yeah, I don't have an answer, and I don't want to steer you wrong and pretend I do. A geologist could better explain it than me.
Sure.
I just know over long periods and cycles of time, the way that the planet's affected is going to affect the landscape, you know. And like the Nile has shifted. The Nile used to be closer. The Nile shifted. Anyway, so if you have this water erosion, how could that be possible if Egypt didn't have, that was the whole thing, right? A mystery of Sphinx. How could this be possible if there's no rain? So John thought this might have went back. It survived the Great Flood. When Schoch came, he said, no, it's not Nile flooding. It's precipitation-induced water erosion. He made two observations. One of them was the erosion. On the body of the Sphinx, the core body, which is what Schwaller referred to, the body, not necessarily the head, which is the hardest, and not below, which is covered up with stone masonry today, but the core body, the middle part, is heavily eroded. And you can see where water runoff may have impacted the Sphinx. But more so, the real evidence is in what's known as the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx was dug out from a ditch. It's not a statue. It wasn't built. Stone was removed to form a ditch, and then they believe those stones are what made the temples in the front, although there's controversy around that, maybe not. Anyway, and then they fashioned this sculpture, the statue. So if you want to envision the Sphinx, you know, it's gone through several stages. Originally it would have been what's known as like a yardang, basically an outcropping. Everything would have been level from the neck up. From the neck up is where the people would be walking, the surface level. And it was just a giant piece of stone, outcropping stone. At some point, somebody started to dig down and fashion a trench around it. And then they fashioned the body. And this is another thing. A lot of people talk about, oh, the head of the Sphinx had to be carved down. It had to be a lion previously. Why? Because if you look at the Sphinx, if you want to pull it up on the screen, try to find an aerial view of the Sphinx. So like Giza or Egypt Sphinx aerial view. When you look at the Sphinx, you'll notice that the head appears to be disproportionate to the very long body. Small head, big long body with a rump in the back. Okay, so
the second one right there?
Second one maybe. Well, actually, that's fine. We'll go with that. Well, the one right in the middle. Yeah, so actually, it's hard to tell from here.
The fourth one? You want that one? Right there?
That might be better. How about this? Put in Sphinx head disproportionate, and maybe because there's better images where you can see.
All right, so let's type in Sphinx head disproportionate. Let's see what we get there. Never gets old looking at this. I don't care what angle you look at it from. It's just amazing.
It never gets old going there.
It doesn't get old. All right.
We want. All right. Well, all right. The one far right, second row, far right. No, go back. Well, yeah, that's showing. All right. All right. Right below that to the right.
Right there.
That.
Okay.
So we can see, this isn't the best example, but we can see the head in the front looks really small compared to this long body with the tail that wraps around. So people are like, oh, it couldn't be the real head. It had to be the head of a lion. You can see an example in the middle there. Maybe it was originally a lion. It existed before pharaonic times or early pharaonic times, and then they carved it down into the face of a pharaoh. We're going to settle this and set the record straight right now here on the Julian Dorey podcast.
Let's do it.
The reason why the head of the Sphinx appears to be disproportionate is because if you look at the back of the Sphinx, it's actually not disproportionate to the original concept of the Sphinx. What I mean by that is the Sphinx we see today isn't even your great-great-granddaddy's Sphinx. There's been so many restorations over time. But originally, you have this outcropping of stone. They start to dig a ditch around it, and then eventually they form the body. And then there's been many restorations from the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom, all the way up in the Greek and Roman times into modern restorations, where they're adding stone masonry around the Sphinx. Originally, well, in the back of the Sphinx, right before the hunch, right before the rump, there's what's known as the Great Fissure. It starts on the plateau, it goes through the enclosure wall of the plateau and runs through the back of the Sphinx, right before the hump, right before the butt. There's a big crack that goes through the Sphinx. Originally, that would have been part of the bedrock, and everything forward would have been your original body of the Sphinx. So the reason why people say the head looks too small for the body is because the body we see today has been expanded to accommodate the Great Fissure. And if people actually looked into the Egyptological, it's been expanded. And if people took the time to actually look into the body of Egyptological work, you go to the sources. Mark Lehner, who's an eminent Egyptologist, he's probably the foremost authority besides, say, Zahi Hawass, who's really more of a face for tourism and stuff. Mark Lehner, his office was in between the paws of the Sphinx. He studied it every day, stone by stone. Few of those who know the Sphinx better than Mark Lehner. And he did a whole survey, literally stone by stone, of the Sphinx. And in his dissertation, which is hundreds of pages, I've read it several times, you can find his dissertation online. On page 410 or 408 of his dissertation, somewhere in there, don't quote me, in between 410 and 408, it's either the first or the second paragraph, he references this and talks about how the fissure is expanded in the back. So in other words, you have, it might be hard for the viewers to see here, but let's say this is the bedrock. Here's the Sphinx. And they carve out the body of the Sphinx. And it would have originally looked like, can you pull up Narmer's palette? Narmer palette. Narmer's palette is what defines the Egyptian civilization.
Is that Narmer's, or are you saying Narmer's because you're from Boston?
I'm saying Narmer from Boston. It's
okay.
Narmer. Narmer's palette. He parked the car in the Harvard Yard with Narmer.
N-A-R, not...
Yeah, N-A-R.
M-E-R.
M-E-R.
Yeah, first one right there. First one. Yep.
Okay.
Right, images.
Click on the images right there. Perfect. And then if you can just zoom in or click on the image so it's full screen. This is the front and back of the Narmer palette. And if you look to the left, you'll see an image of Narmer. Catfish chisel. That's what Narmer.
Catfish chisel.
Yeah. That's what Narmer means in ancient Egyptian language. The hieroglyphs are right up above that say catfish, symbol for catfish, and chisel. That's his name, Catfish Chisel.
Got it.
Narmer, also known to the Greeks as Menes. He's the first, not really the first because it's a really gray area, Dynasty 0, and there were rulers before him. But Narmer is what begins Egyptian civilization as we know it for scholarship. We define ancient Egyptian civilization by a chronological timeline when starts when Narmer unified the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, the North and the West, brought the two lands together. That's the beginning of ancient Egyptian dynastic civilization, which then we have Dynasty 1, 2, 3, all the way up. There is some controversy and it is still disputed about Dynasty 0, and then there's rulers before. It's a very gray area. We don't have a lot of information. In fact, I just came back from Necken, which is a site that we were one of the first public groups to actually bring a tour group to this site. We had to get special permissions. It took me a long time to set it up, and thankfully, because I have good relationships from Alexandria to Aswan and with the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt, we were able to get access for Dr. David Miano's tour, and I was able to lead them to Necken. Necken is important because it's one of the oldest ancient Egyptian sites, and it's where they dug the Narmer palette. I literally stood on the mound that they pulled this thing out of. Few eyes ever get to see this, Julian. Most tourists that go to Egypt never see this. In fact, most Egyptians don't even know about it. I asked the local Egyptians, they're like, what and where is Necken?
So you're the plug.
I'm the plug. So we took the group there, and it's a significant site, and this is where they pull Narmer's palette out from, and it's not very well excavated. There's still much more work to be done. And I've had discussions with Egyptologists about this. If we were to do more excavations at Necken, we're probably going to be able to learn more about early and pre-dynastic history. We already know a little bit about pre-dynastic history from the area, like early prototypes, we could say, of Egyptian hieroglyphs where they would use different glyphic symbols on ivory tags, bone tags, which the language seems to slowly develop or quickly develop from that. Anyway.
Can we pull up Narmer's again? Sorry.
Yeah, so Narmer's palette. We want to take a look at Narmer's palette. It looks like a shield, but it wasn't used as a shield. It was actually used for the makeup for the eyes. There's a circle, and they would put their stuff in there, their paint. All right, so look on the left. We have Narmer. Narmer in his right hand is holding the war mace. He's grabbing the enemies by the hair. They're on their knees. Just above the enemy's head, we notice the falcon, and it's on top of what has like this elongated horizontal body and the head. I don't know if you can zoom in. Are you able to zoom in on that image? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I got to give a shout out to Matt Simpson at Ancient Architects YouTube channel. He was the first to really conceptualize a theory around this. But in any event, this is a good demonstration of what the Sphinx may have originally looked like. So it's a good tool to use. So imagine the head was just an outcrop of stone, and then you fashion this body, and that looks, proportionately, that's fine. That would have been an early rendition of what the Sphinx would have looked like. And then right at the end was this big fissure.
Oh, shit.
Yes. The light bulb has gone off with Julian.
Yeah.
So right at it where you see it truncate in the back to the far right, what looks like his butt, they wanted to extend that to make hunches to turn it into an actual Sphinx. To make it have the hunches of the rump of the Sphinx. So they had to carve over the fissure. They had to expand the Sphinx. And then from there, they added a tail, and they added legs, and then they added bricks to the front of that to make the paws of the Sphinx. And then over time, there's been different restorations and so forth. So what I'm saying is, look at your original Sphinx. This is aside from the outcropping of the rock, then they fashion the face, then they make the body, and everything would have been proportionate. Everything from the Great Fissure forward is proportionate. The reason why people think it's disproportionate and use that as evidence to say, oh, it was carved down from an older head, is because they're taking into account what the Sphinx looks like today, which would have had an expanded. Now go back to the Sphinx. Put in side profile of Egyptian Sphinx.
Side profile Egyptian Sphinx. Did I mishear this 10 minutes ago? I want to make sure I'm following all this because it's kind of blowing my mind. But you were saying that they elongated it over time?
Yeah, correct.
And how long is that time?
That's another $1 million question, Julian, and that's one I'm still trying to research, and I don't know how we could figure that out because, again, Mark Lehner accounts for it, but he doesn't say how long it took.
Right.
So we don't know exactly. Again, Schoch and Dobeke did seismic refraction survey. We can kind of determine dating from their interpretations with some things in the back because the levels in the back are like, 1 to 3 meters, and then it dips down. Anyway, so here's the side profile. So look at the big picture we're looking at here on the right. You see where it's like light in the back? It looks like light's reflecting. From where the light reflects back is where the Great Fissure is. Actually, can you put in, well, before we move off of this, so from that light source forward, kind of matches, and now imagine if the paws weren't there, it kind of matches that image you've seen of a horizontal body with a head.
Yeah.
That and keep in mind that Narmer palette goes back to the earliest parts of Egyptian civilization, right? And so,
but it doesn't have the thing sticking up.
It doesn't have the thing sticking out, but the Sphinx is missing something sticking out of its head, because so Google.
But the things were in the Narmer's palette.
Go back to Narmer's. Click on Narmer's palette. Let's go back to Narmer's palette.
Narmer's palette.
Yeah. Okay. So you see, well, it's sticking out of the back.
Right.
Now go back to the image of the Sphinx. And look at the image in the middle, the white background, how it has a crown. The Sphinx has a crown. Do you see second row, third image in?
Oh, yeah.
Has a crown. It likely would have had one. The Sphinx today has a giant hole in its head. It goes down about 6 feet. However, it was filled with cement in the early 20th century by Emile Barrace, an Egyptologist. So there's still images of it where you could see a man, before they filled it with cement, you can see a man standing inside of the hole in the head of the Sphinx. And we can get into the different entrances into the Sphinx in the so-called Hall of Records if you want to cover that too.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah,
I did a whole expose on this on my YouTube channel, Anyextee on YouTube, where I go into the hidden entrances, origins, and mysteries of the Great Sphinx.
Link in description, by the way. It's an excellent channel, so everyone make sure you go subscribe to that. But go ahead.
Thank you kindly. And I will confirm it is an excellent channel. It just doesn't have. Don't let the low subscribers fool you. I think I have like
I
about
never get
50K.
fooled by that. If it's quality, it's quality. I don't give a fuck.
Well, people tell me all the time. They're like, "Me, you have all this amazing content, all this knowledge, and,
it's all right.
nobody's
you just
talking."
need your spark. Here you go. Let's get it.
Thank you, Julian.
All right. So here we go.
So if you go, I lived in Luxor. In Luxor, we have the Luxor. I lived in Egypt for a while. when you go to Luxor Museum, there's a small Sphinx statue of King Tut as the Sphinx. He takes on another form. And you can see the crown on the head of the statue. It's like a Lego piece. It goes into the hole and snaps together. So it's likely that the Sphinx, the great Sphinx, once had a crown, now missing. Also, it had a beard, and we know it had the beard, the royal beard of the pharaoh. It broke off because the pieces are in the Cairo Museum and the British Museum. Multiple pieces, and it likely had a statue of Osiris that was added beneath the beard. Those pieces are missing today. My point is, though, if you were to extend, so if we go back to the other image where the light is on the side profile of the Sphinx there, if you take into account from where you see the light and the dark in the back rump of the Sphinx, that's right around where the fissure is. And everything forward would be proportionate. The head is proportionate. Forget the pause. Pretend there's no pause. The head is proportionate to this horizontal mound, which looks similar to the motif that we find on the Narmer palette. And what I'm proposing is that, and what it says in the Egyptological record is that in order to form a rump in the back, they had to go past the fissure, and that's what gives it that look. And now that they've created this big rump, the Sphinx appears disproportionate, but then they go and add the tail and the paws. And so people take that and they're like, the head is too small, it doesn't fit the body, because the original body isn't the body we see today. And it probably developed over time from an outcropping. Maybe they carved the face, and then they decided to carve out the horizontal platform. And then they decided to turn it into a Sphinx, and they added the tail. It might not have been one concept from the beginning, and it wouldn't be unusual for it to come out of the living bedrock. It has a deeper esoteric, there's a cosmological concept to it, the one coming out of creation, like a lot of these block statues where people are coming out of the block. Yes. It's spirit trapped in matter. It's another way of expressing it. So that's it. So it's not that the head is disproportionate to the body, it's disproportionate to the body we see today, and that body is an expansion of what was likely the original concept for the Sphinx.
And what were your findings in all the different holes and crevices of the Sphinx that you did the full video on? Because I watched this one. This was pretty nuts.
Yeah. So and I've changed. Well, I won't say I changed my views, but in the video,
that's okay.
I champion John. Well, I do change my views. In the video, I champion John Anthony West's theory, the water erosion theory, and I explain it. I talk about all the entrances, but I also talk about the water erosion hypothesis and make a strong case for it. But today, this video is, I don't know how many years old, but and I don't mind telling somebody's story or somebody's narrative. It doesn't mean that I personally agree or conclude. So back to the water erosion theory with John Anthony West, because Egypt didn't see that kind of water, it must mean that it's older. And so Schoch made two observations: the water erosion on the body of the Sphinx, and then, the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure itself, which suggested that it was precipitation-induced water erosion. In other words, rainfall that had eroded the Sphinx over time. And then the other observation was from the geophysical survey. I said he did a seismic refraction survey where they set lines up around the Sphinx to determine. And from that, this is interesting too, because a lot of people will argue the Sphinx is 10,000 years old, 20,000 years old, 30,000 years old. According to Dr. Robert Schoch's work, with that seismic refraction survey with Thomas DeBecke in early 90s, the Sphinx cannot be more than 10,000 years old. And when Schoch first started with West, he was still, with university, he was up for tenure, so he had to be very cautious, and he took a conservative approach. And he said, okay, the Sphinx is likely, it could go back 5,000-6,000 years. He was taking a conservative approach, even though the data shows it could go back further. But he was trying to find a conservative approach because Egyptology suggests the Sphinx is around 2,500 BC. Schoch saying, no, it could be 5,000-6,000 years earlier, because that puts it back to a period where there was heavier rainfall. Later in his career, after performing at Contact in the Desert and Ancient Alien conferences and being on Ancient Aliens and getting all these speaking gigs, he changes his interpretation, and now he pushes it back and says, no, actually, I think it's closer to 10,000 BC. Could be as old as 10,000 BC. But it can't, according to his data, which is behind a paywall and difficult to get to, if you go look at that data, according to the data, it can't be older than 10,000 BC. Based on the results, his own data sets. So this makes a case for Sphinx not being older than 10,000 BC. Me personally, I think it's right around where the Egyptologists say it is. Maybe a few hundred years older. I will say, I don't believe the Sphinx was carved before 3500 BCE.
Based on what?
Well, there's brand new evidence. There's a new study that came out in 2022. John Anthony West passed away in 2018. And I often ask myself, what would he say in the face of this evidence? There's also a new proponent for the other side, Robert Schneiker, geophysicist, who's making a case for this as well. The study was about the Khufu branch of the Nile. They discovered this branch that came off the Nile. There are these canals that would go right up to the pyramids. And the study also shows that during periods in Egypt, that during the African human period and before that, there was so much rainfall that the position of the Sphinx, it's low on the Mokattam rock formation, it's low on the platform, on the plateau, and it's right next to where the water is, that at this time, the Sphinx would have been covered in water, that the water flow would have been much higher and much more forceful. So Robert Schneiker contends that, with this knowledge and with this being the case, as well as he's got a lot more to, add to this, I won't articulate his narrative as well. In fact, he's somebody you may want to have on the show. In fact, if you really want to have an event, what needs to happen right now in this space is for Robert Schneiker and Dr. Robert Schoch to have a debate.
Let's do it, boys.
You can do it right here on the Julian Dorey podcast.
Boys. You can come co-host it with me.
I can't speak for someone else. I don't think Schoch will do it, but I'm fairly certain.
Come on, Bobby. Come on, baby.
Schneiker would love to do it because
I don't bite.
This is the newest information, and Schoch is still repeating all the old information, his old narrative, and he has not. And he said himself in the past, if it can be demonstrated I was wrong, I'll stand correct. But he has not yet once addressed the issues that are being raised by Robert Schneiker, and a lot of people get this wrong. I just watched I remember the Graham Hancock and Flint Dibble debate on Joe Rogan.
That was a tough one.
They talk about how Rogan has it in his mind that all the geologists agree with Dr. Robert Schoch, that there's a consensus. That isn't accurate. That's because that's what he was told, because that's a story that's been perpetuated, and that's not exactly what happened. The reason for this is in the early 90s, John Anthony West, Dr. Robert Schoch went to a geological convention. They weren't actually part of the actual presentation. They were, in a sense, that they had a poster board out in the hallway. They weren't on the conference panels. They had a poster board in the hallway to present this theory. They collected a lot of emails, and that's the extent of it. That doesn't mean the emails they collected from other geologists is a strong cosign in their theory.
Right.
It's not. In fact, several independent geologists, most geologists don't care about the Sphinx, but several independent geologists have studied it. And there's this idea that needs to be dismantled today on the Julian Dorey podcast, that all the geologists are against Egyptologists. And in fact, I don't know any geologist that entirely agree with Dr. Robert Schoch's conclusion. You have Lal Gary, though you have the geologist that originally said it was wind and sand erosion. Then Schoch says, no, it's precipitation-induced water erosion. Therefore, the Sphinx must be older because Egypt didn't see this amount of water during the time that the Egyptologists are saying. You also have Colin Reeder, who aligns with some of Schoch's ideas. And I like Reeder's. This is why I think the Sphinx could be a few hundred years earlier than the Egyptologists thing. Reeder puts together a great presentation. He's also a geologist, and he's independently studied at the Sphinx. He says he wrote a paper that Khufu knew the Sphinx. Khufu is the father of Khafra. Since the Sphinx is supposed to have been fashioned during the time of Khafra, Khufu shouldn't know about the Sphinx. Why does he say this? Because of the inventory stela.
The inventory stela.
The inventory stela. It was discovered at Giza. It was behind, it was at the Isis temple, which is...
Oh, that's unfortunately named, but I know.
You're absolutely right, because that's the Greek word for Iset or
exactly.
Oset.
It was such a beautiful name, and they fucked
until
it
the
up.
terrorists...
Right.
Well, the thing is, I know it's often associated with the terrorists, but that's actually the Greek term for Oset or Iset.
Right, exactly.
It's Osea and Oset, Osiris, and even Horus is actually Heru.
Yeah.
It means the house of Hathor. So anyway, Iset, Isis, strong character and, figure in Egyptian tradition. It was a temple that was consecrated to her, the remains, and there they found the inventory stela. And on this stela, it references Khufu, and it references the Sphinx. How is this possible? Khufu predates the Sphinx. How could it be referencing Khufu in the Sphinx? Well, let's turn to Egyptology. What do the Egyptologists say? Because we can just take the alternative historians and YouTubers who want to sell books and tours at their word, and think the Egyptologists are covering stuff up, or we can actually go to the Egyptologists. And this is what I'm trying to do by bringing more balance.
Bridge the gap. Yeah.
Yeah, because, you know, I lived in Egypt. I used to sit down and drink coffee. I'd go into their homes. I met their families. These are real people with children and family. It's not some evil cabal conspiracy theories that are trying to cover everything up.
I don't like the idea of defining everything as one. What has pissed me off in the past is when the ivory tower causes that hardcore reaction on the other side. Fuck that. And I've called that out before. But the idea that, like, therefore everyone is Zahi Hawass or whatever, that's not fair. I want to judge facts on their individual basis or whatever.
Yeah, so I agree. And that's why I think it's important to bring balance to the conversation and actually look at the archaeological record, because you can go to the alternative side and have them go, oh, the Egyptologists, they're just covering everything up. What do they know? Here's the real evidence. See it on my YouTube channel. Or you can actually make the effort, like I did, to go into the record and see what they actually say. Don't wait for the alternative historian to cherry pick one phrase and attack. Go and study it. Right. Learn the Egyptian hieroglyphs. That's right. The hieroglyphs will tell you what's in the relief.
Let's finish up this point on the Sphinx and some of the holes and crevices within it that we've been beating around the bush on right here, and then we're gonna take a quick break, go to the bathroom, and come back, and it's gonna be a second episode. Like we're flowing right here. So anyway, let's finish this point, and then we'll do that.
This is a long point because there's a lot of entrances to the Sphinx. So let's run through them quickly. This will be, if you want a more detailed, you can go back to my YouTube channel,
we'll
Anyextee, to check it out. So anyway, okay, hidden entrances into the Sphinx. And why is this important? Because of the Hall of Records. You're familiar with the Hall of Records?
Yes.
The Hall of Records, so basically, what you have is something known as the Hall of Records. And it was popularized by Edgar Cayce, the sleeping American prophet. Edgar Cayce would lay down, go to sleep, and then come back and give readings that would be recorded. And he would make predictions. He has all sort of prophecies. A lot of them didn't line up. But one of the things he said is that there's a Hall of Records beneath the paws of the Sphinx. And I used to believe it was a possibility. Back in 1996, my friends and I, we were making rap songs about the Hall of Records under the paws of the Sphinx, you know? But is there actually a Hall of Records under the Sphinx? And this whole idea that it was popularized by Edgar Cayce, right? Wrong. It actually predates Edgar Cayce. Okay, before Edgar Cayce, you have the first imperator of the Rosicrucian order, Amorc. That is the ancient mystical order Rosicrucius, the Rosicrucian order Amorc, which is still active today. Their first imperator, Harvey Spencer Lewis, published a book, proprietary information at first. Now you can find it publicly. It was produced by and for the Rosicrucians, Symbolic Prophecy of the Sphinx. And within that book, he includes a diagram of what appears to be a temple beneath the Sphinx. He says it came from a Rosicrucian manuscript. Keep in mind, the Rosicrucians were in Egypt very early on. They were there during the time of eminent Egyptologist Salim Hussein, who was doing excavations at the Sphinx. Did they get information? Where did this come from? There's a lot of controversy around this, Julian, because there's another esoteric author who goes by the pen name El-Eros. El-Eros, yeah, and he had his own Knights Templar organization that he created. And a lot of these Knights Templar organizations, when you actually, I have a film on the, anyway, whatever.
Next episode.
Another episode. So, so the Hall of Records, originally the Hall of Mysteries, according to El-Eros, years before the Edgar Cayce prophecy. And this hall and hidden temple under the Sphinx was published in Harvey Spencer Lewis's book, The Rose. How would Edgar Cayce know this? Well, we know because it's on record that he has this organization, ARE, and West Virginia, I believe. Anyway, there in the archives, it's marked in the 300s somewhere, we have evidence, proof that he had clients who were Rosicrucians. And Edgar Cayce was well aware of esoteric literature. So he most likely read Harvey Spencer Lewis's account or had access to the other account, which is El-Eros. El-Eros talked about a hall of mysteries under the Sphinx. He talked about a whole Masonic plan for Egypt. How did he know? He said it was channeled. He channeled it. Channeled.
Oh.
Yeah.
Very trustworthy.
Yeah. So whenever there's channeling involved, I would take it with a grain of salt. Not to say I don't believe that humans have the ability to go within and connect with the divine.
I'm channeling an 18-inch cock right now.
What does it look like, Julian?
I don't have it. I'm sorry.
Well, it takes years of initiation through esoteric traditions.
That's right.
Meditations. And I mean, there's been some people that have done amazing things. Paramahansa Yogananda would be one who through meditation. You know Yogananda?
Nope.
Oh, man. You know who you have an iPhone?
Yeah.
You know who Steve Jobs is, right?
I know who Steve Jobs is.
At Steve Jobs' memorial service, he left one gift behind for his friends and a message, self-actualize. And that gift was, and when he passed, when he transitioned into the afterlife, there was only one book on his iPhone in the digital ebooks section. That book was Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda.
I don't remember this. Wow. I've studied Steve Jobs' life like crazy, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Steve Jobs developed the iPhone through meditation. He conceptualized a lot through meditation, and he was a big fan of Yogananda. Yogananda brought Kriya Pranayama Yoga meditation to the West.
He brought what?
Yeah. Kriya Pranayama Yoga meditation.
Okay.
And so it's in short, it's the science of Kriya Yoga. It's a tradition that goes back, Hindu tradition that goes back. And he learned from his mentor, Sri Yukteswar, and before him, Babaji. There's a whole lineage. Anyway, Yogananda came to the East. It was my hometown of Boston, and he traveled to Mexico. He settled in California, where they have today his organization, the which I'm a member of, Self-Realization Fellowship. If you want to learn the science of Kriya Pranayama Yoga, which is effectively how you channel the inner currents, subtle currents in your body, and work them up through the glands, through different breathing exercises and breathing, you change your breath, you change your consciousness, and use that to interact with the glands, which correspond in Eastern tradition to the chakras, or what the Rosicrucians refer to as psychic centers, which science can't measure. But if it's a whole process. The process is to ultimately channel that energy up to your back, through your spine, to have what's known as a Kundalini experience.
Yeah.
The serpent goes up the spine.
I know that one.
You're shaking, you're bringing the energy up to your pineal gland, your third eye.
Yeah.
But it's not, everybody talks about the third eye. This is your mystical eye. You close your eyes, you can still see, you can still remember and create, right? You have inner vision.
That's right.
Right? So not limited to your sight and your senses. You also have your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland. And they don't really teach us a lot about these things in school. The glands are so, even in modern science today, like we know a bit, but we don't know everything about the glands. Esoteric traditions, like the Rosicrucians, focus on teaching about the glands because, it was important for the mystical process. Your hypothalamus is and your pituitary gland is what's going to effectively help you to achieve, you could say, altered states of consciousness. Also, we have what's known as von Economo neurons. There's a heavy concentration, dense concentration of von Economo neurons named after von Economo in the front of our head. The whole idea is to suppress those neurons to open up a connection. This is gnosis, to channel, to receive a divine connection. It's like your brain is a projector. You go into the light of the projector to receive. It's not that your brain, people will be like, oh, when you meditate, you got to close out the monkey mind chatter. You have to stop what's going on. You can never stop thinking, but you can move things around in a way, according to these traditions, to access. This is what Indian rishis and yogis have been doing for years.
So you got into this because you were saying this dude was channeling by the fucking poles.
Well, I got into Yogananda because of Steve Jobs, because the whole thing is Steve Jobs' channel. He wanted everyone to know about Yogananda and his work. Yogananda's in my top 3 must-read books.
Okay.
I
might have to check that
Autobiography of a Yogi changed my life.
Yeah.
You might need to suspend some of your imagination in the beginning, but go through the book. The thing that really does it for me is Yogananda died consciously. When you look into the eyes of Paramahansa Yogananda, when you look into the eyes of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, you're going to know. You're going to see something, and you're going to realize this is a realized individual. There's something different about them. Yogananda would teach Kriya Pranayama Yoga, and he died conscious. He chose the moment of his death. He said, and before an audience, I am going to die now. Dropped, died, and his body didn't decompose.
Whoa.
Look up Paramahansa Yogananda.
All right. Yeah. I'm going to have to check this out afterwards. But who was the guy channeling?
So back to the channeling. I'm glad you keep me on track here, Julian.
Yeah, I got to.
So
I'm trying to help you. I know you got to go to the bathroom.
My whole point is there's meditative practices which I find very interesting. I practice meditation.
I saw you doing it right before
I did the interview.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So I try to make time to meditate every day. If I had it my way and life didn't get in the way, the 2 things I love most, reading and meditation. But if I had to choose one, it would be meditation. I love to be in a constant state of meditation, cosmic bliss, connecting with.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So anyway, And when I say meditation and yoga, I'm not talking about these poses. Those poses are like they're for specific currents in your body. There's a whole science to it. Anyway, so I was just trying to make a disclaimer that like I don't want to turn people off and think like, all channeling is fake. I will say that I think a vast majority of people that claim to be channeling are faking the funk to sell books, get attention.
Absolutely.
Maybe they believe it themselves. You can never tell another person's personal experience. So I don't want to judge anyone. But I will say that there are a lot of authors who tend to use channeling as evidence for whatever it is they're presenting. Gotcha. Like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. Dorey will channel them. Anyway, so channeling isn't really verifiable.
So
it's
this guy's channeling isn't, we can't take that as...
Who are we even talking about? Who was channeling?
It was the guy...
Oh, Elios. So Elios channeled this Masonic plan. And there's some controversy. Who came first, Harvey Spencer Lewis's book or Elios? We're not exactly certain, but it's quite possible that, one influenced the other. We don't know with certainty. But anyway, long story short, then you get, fast forward almost a decade, you have what everyone knows is Edgar Cayce. He's the one that the Hall of Records, they think originates with him. It doesn't. It originates with the Rosicrucians and with Elios. But Edgar Cayce said there's a Hall of Records under the Sphinx. So it set this big craze off where everyone wanted to go and check beneath the Sphinx. There's been multiple studies where they found cavities around the Sphinx, natural cavities beneath the Sphinx. When Dr. Robert Schoch and Thomas Dobeke did the seismic refraction survey around the Sphinx, they detected a big anomaly north of the Sphinx, and they believe that there's something that appears to look like a chamber. And this is Schoch's interpretation. He says because it appears to be right angles, and there are supposed to be, or it's believed that there's not any exact right angles in nature, although you can find some instances, but there's not supposed to be angles in nature. So the whole idea is, well, look, if this looks like a right angle, it must be a subterranean structure, which gives credit to Edgar Cayce's Hall of Records. I mentioned Mark Lehner earlier. He's the foremost Egyptologist when it comes to the Sphinx. He did this the big study, the official one on the Sphinx. He got into this, like me, came into this through the alternative side. His parents were a part of the Edgar Cayce organization. In fact, that organization funded his education to become an actual Egyptologist, archaeologist, so that he could go find this Hall of Records. And he did that. And after he looked at everything in the Sphinx, he came to the realization that, it's not what they say it is. And now he's all the way on the other side of the field. And he's one of the main proponents with Zahi that, and that's what often happens. That's like me. I came in through the fascination and the sensationalism, but then I wanted to study and dig deeper. When you look at the stuff, you realize that it's not all, what it's cracked up to be. So, so that's basically, you have a Hall of Records. And so how do you get into that Hall of Records? This is where it opens up, the entrances. How would we get into the Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx? Let's talk about entrances into the Sphinx.
Please.
There's an entrance between the paws that few people know about. Between the paws of the Sphinx is what's known as the Dream Stealer, which is the work of Tutmosis IV. It commemorates him clearing. He went to the Sphinx, he fell asleep or got into a meditative state by the Sphinx and channeled the Sphinx. The Sphinx spoke to him. This is Egyptian history. The Sphinx came to him in a dream. And you have to be careful whenever they put dream in literal text because we're not entirely certain what that means because we could be interpreting it as dream, but it could be an altered state of consciousness. It could be a meditative state. And the Sphinx came to him, Hor-em-Akhet, one of the names of the Sphinx, right? Sphinx has been known by many names throughout history. Hor-em-Akhet, Horus on the horizon. Seshep-Ankh-Atum, living image of Atum. Abu Hol, the terrifying one, Tefnut, Spit-a-Nut, and recent textual evidence in alternative circles suggested it may have been Mahit. Anyway, we know that Tutmosis IV was referring to him as Hor-em-Akhet, Horus on the horizon, because it's in this stela. Stela is a stone that commemorates an experience that has all hieroglyphs, and it references the Sphinx as Hor-em-Akhet. And so at this time, this is in the New Kingdom of Egypt. The Sphinx is already ancient. The Sphinx is supposed to have come into fashion in the Old Kingdom. This is the New Kingdom. And the Sphinx tells Tutmosis, clear away the sand from my paws, because it was up to its neck in sand. Clear away the sand, and you'll have the right to rule over Egypt. So he did that to legitimize himself. He built a wall, a Temenus wall, to prevent more wind and sand from blowing on.
Right.
So how do we know how to get into the Sphinx? Behind this dream stela, it's covered up now because the Egyptologists have done a cover up, but not intentionally. They're trying to preserve it.
Yeah.
In most cases, when they're covering something up, it's because they don't want people to go in and fall down, get hurt, and have a liability, or they just haven't finished publishing academic papers on it. So it's not ready. It's not that they're trying to hide lost technology from the public. But believe me, I know the Egyptologists. They wish there was lost technology. Their jobs would be easier, you know? And so Egypt would be further along. It wouldn't be struggling in a developing country in a sense. So there's this passage beneath the Sphinx. And I had long thought that if there is an entrance to the Hall of Records, it must be between the paws of the Sphinx. You have two paws, this is the, rule of thirds, two flanking, either there's two obelisks or two pylons, which from two paws, where would they be? It would be in the center. And so I was like, but you can't see because the Dream Steel is there and they've built up this little structure that has a trap door, an iron trap door that you can go down into. Well, we can't see what's in there. So if you were to come to Egypt on your own accord and you were to go to the Giza Plateau, have you ever been to Egypt?
I was, yeah.
Okay.
I was
Probably
there.
younger with your family or something.
I was there when I was 16 for a couple days and when I was 18 for a couple days.
So you couldn't really appreciate the deeper
That's
esoteric
exactly right.
aspects
Yes.
that you will when
I thought-
Anyextee brings you to Egypt.
Exactly. I thought it was so cool. Don't get me wrong. We went to pyramids. I was like, wow, awesome. All right, let's go.
Yeah,
like there was,
basically. Take a picture.
And I love history, but at that point in my life, I wasn't yet like crazy deep on like ancient history at the time. So it was just really cool. Like, wow, they built this, but I wasn't thinking about all the little details and intricate things of like, wait a minute, how the fuck did this even happen? And now, if I went there, I'd be like, oh, you know.
And you'd know more. You'd have
Yes,
more context and that's important.
I still got to learn so much. I'm such a novice with it, but it's so cool. Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.